Hi, Lance Roberts here with the Real Investment Show podcast with Loren Steffy, author of the new book, George P. Mitchell, Fracking, Sustainability, and an Unorthodox Approach to Saving the Planet. Loren, welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
So let's just start out with kind of the big broad stroke. Why George P. Mitchell and a biography on him?
Yeah, well, first of all, because there hadn't been one. There had not been a comprehensive biography of George Mitchell. And a few years back, I was looking at my next book project, and I decided I really wanted to do a business biography about somebody in Texas. But I wanted it to be, somebody who had actually affected people's lives in a very fundamental way. Not just somebody, and I don't want to say just somebody who built a good company or that kind of thing, but somebody that actually kind of transcended the business realm and affected people in their everyday lives.
Well, and it's interesting because just recently T. Boone Pickens passed away, another kind of big figure in the oil industry. And, as we were talking about a little earlier, kind of off air, is that both of them were big supporters of natural gas as an alternative fuel source, which, is interesting in today's society because we're all focused on electric vehicles, which actually have a bigger carbon footprint than, a lot of other forms. But, we overlook natural gas is an alternative source.
It's really interesting because George Mitchell said in the early 1970s that he saw natural gas as the fuel of the future. Obviously, Boone Pickens was promoting natural gas and natural gas vehicles. I mean, I remember writing about him converting his Cadillac to run on compressed natural gas in like 1990. So, I mean, they both were big advocates. They didn't really know each other very well. They met a few times. They weren't terribly close, but they both had this sort of contrarian view within the industry, and they both were kind of looking at what was coming next.
Right. Well, so, kind of the focus of the book, of course, is fracking. And I think this is an interesting topic, particularly in light of the fact of the recent attack on the Saudi oil wells. And, of course, with the IPO of Saudi Aramco coming up here very shortly. The United States has transitioned. And I remember in 2008, we were all talking about peak oil. It was the pre-climate change edition of what was going to kill the economy. And it was peak oil. We're all going to die from peak oil. And now we seem to really kind of be awash in it because of this fracking miracle that, kind of really took over. And now not only are we a producer of oil, we're now a net exporter of oil, which is a dramatic transformation in just a decade.
It's an unbelievable change. And I made the point the other day, when you see what's happened with this attack on the Saudi refineries, the Saudi plants in the Middle East, if that had happened 10 years ago, we'd already have $4 gasoline, right? I mean, and now the market's kind of greeting it with essentially a shrug, right? I mean, you had a little bit of a surge in price, but it's already mitigating. And so, and that really is a direct result of the fact that we have this newfound energy abundance, which all comes from fracking. I mean, it's really an incredible turnaround that we've seen in a very short period of time. And we were talking about peak oil, now we're talking about peak demand. Right. So it's really kind of incredible.
Well, and it really has turned the corner a lot, and it's interesting. When we look at the dynamics of, how the industries have changed, traditional oil well drilling has really taken a back seat now to shale drilling. There's a lot of focus in, shale drilling, particularly in the Permian Basin and others. But is this potentially as you were doing your studies and looking at this and writing this book, is this a typical transition of the oil industry where we tend to go too far in one direction with one thing, in this particular case, shale drilling?
I don't think so, because what was happening, and the Permian is a great example of this. I mean, by the mid-2000s, most people in the business were figuring that the Permian had pretty well played out. You talk to people in Midland, they were ready to pack up and go somewhere else. And this has really opened up literally a whole new layer of reserves that we could not get to before. Nobody thought before George Mitchell perfected fracking that we could get oil and gas out of shale formations. I mean, geologists would tell you, they knew it was there, but extracting it, was kind of crazy. I mean, it just couldn't do it economically. And so, and of course, it took him many, many years. It took him 17 years of trying, and, by some estimates, probably almost $1 billion of his own company's money, if you count land acquisition costs and stuff. And so it was really a remarkable lesson in perseverance and kind of stubborn determination in a lot of ways.
Well, so as you were writing this book, what was the one thing that really kind of jumped out to you? Did you learn something fascinating about George Mitchell that you didn't kind of know already?
I think that I knew that he was obviously involved in fracking. As an energy reporter, I was very well aware of the role he played there. I lived in the woodlands, so I was aware of what he had done with sustainable development. But I don't think I really had tied everything together. I mean, this was not a guy who did one thing or another thing or even a couple of things. He was constantly looking at new ideas. He was just a very broad thinker and a very broad visionary. And what he was really concerned about, and the reason we have such an unwieldy title on the book, is it was more than just fracking. It was more than just sustainability. It really was looking at how do we save the planet? How do we make the planet livable 100 years from now if our population keeps growing and we keep using resources? And those are the kind of things he spent a lot of time sitting around thinking about. He later had the Woodlands conferences where they talked about things like that. And if he found somebody that was interested in those ideas, he would sort of latch onto them. He would immediately call them, reach out to them, and try to get them to come and talk to him. And that was really true right up until the final years of his life. He had been rather dismissive of climate change, as a geologist, but his son Todd kind of convinced him, no, you need to take a different look at this, and he started looking at the numbers, and he wound up writing the piece with Michael Bloomberg about fracking and about the need to be careful in how we're doing this. And so, one of the things that was fascinating to me was this was a guy who was very intellectually curious and always, sort of took the time to really study an issue and came to an informed view about it.
Well, and now what you just said is extremely interesting, because if you listen to the mainstream media and the climate change side of the argument, right? So I'm not making an argument one way or the other for climate change. I'm just saying if you look at the claims about climate change, it's all due to the evil oil and gas industry. A lot of the Democratic candidates that are running for office in 2020 have very specific views about climate change. One of our young Democratic representatives claims the world's going to end in 10 years because of oil and gas. We've got to get rid of the oil and gas industry because it's the purveyor of climate change. But yet this was exactly what George Mitchell was saying. No, this isn't the case. We can actually create a better climate even with oil and gas.
First of all, he would say that, are there problems with fracking? Certainly. We need to be more careful about methane releases. We need to, the earthquake situation with the disposal wells. These are all problems that resulted from, the expansion of fracking, but they're solvable problems, right? And so he would say, okay, this is a problem. How do we take it to the next step? How do we solve these problems and move forward? But the other thing that was interesting about George Mitchell was he had a lot of disregard or disdain for people in his own industry, in the oil and gas industry, because he thought they didn't do enough to think about these big problems and to solve them. But he also had a lot of disdain for the environmentalists who thought that, the solution was kind of just this absolutism and there's only one way to solve things. He really saw more of a middle ground. To him, for example, sustainability was not just about environmentalism. There was also an economic component. It was also about sustaining human life as well as the natural world. And he believed there was a way to strike a balance there. So his view would probably be much more nuanced. And I think he would say, he predicted that natural gas would be a fuel to the future as well as of the future. And I think you're seeing that. To him, there was no, his son Todd once dubbed this the Mitchell paradox, right? That he did fracking and sustainability. But really, I think in his mind, there was no sort of conflict there because one thing led to another. So fracking was one element, sustainability was another element, and what you end up with is a more livable planet.
So, this idea of natural gas being a fuel of the future, before George Mitchell died, as he was working through these ideas, we have seen that transition. We now have what's called autogas, which is propane that's being used in buses and transportation. A lot of school districts are moving that to try to save fuel and to be cleaner, to be environmentally friendly. We haven't really seen the adoption, though, and this has always been kind of interesting, the adoption of natural gas vehicles. We have natural gas, pipelines running virtually everywhere. It'd be very easy to convert it, add a natural gas, to a natural gas outlet to a gas station for natural gas cars, but we've just never really seen, the infrastructure is pretty much all there. It'd be very easy to convert to that. But there's never really been an adoption. Did George Mitchell ever kind of understand that?
He never really talked about natural gas vehicles at length. That was much more Boone Pickens, But I think, what you're seeing in the transportation market is we're realizing there isn't one solution. You're starting to see heavy trucks, fleet vehicles, things like that move to natural gas. I believe FedEx and UPS both have, if not their entire fleet, close to their entire fleet, they're definitely going in the direction of powering them with natural gas. That's a huge shift. If we get all of those vehicles onto a cleaner fuel, that's going to make a big difference. For consumers, it's a little trickier. You know, compressed natural gas takes up a lot of space in the car. You know, you have to give up your trunk space, basically. And a lot of people are afraid of having, you know, something that compressed, that pressurized in their vehicle if they get hit or whatnot. So I think, you know, you probably are going to see more of a move toward electric cars. But in electric cars, natural gas plays a role too, because we're going to be using it to generate more and more of our electricity. We've already seen it replace coal. And while renewables are going to continue to grow, natural gas is going to continue to play a supporting role or a key role in that mix going forward.
Well, I think, and again, if you take a look at the efficiencies of electric generation, as an example, wind power, solar power versus natural gas versus oil versus coal, you know, the efficiencies of how much electricity that you can produce from natural gas far outstrips what you can produce out of solar or out of wind. And you know, yes, those productions, the ability to produce electricity with solar and wind is becoming a lot cheaper. But still, it comes down to the efficiency of how much I can produce at one time. And again, we have a very big demand for electricity. And of course, if we add on now that every car is going to be electric ultimately, or at least a hybrid of some sort, trying to become more fuel efficient, the demand for natural gas and the demand for electricity is going to be exponentially larger. So, you know, where does that really fit into a lot of current kind of oil and gas companies now? And what's the future for companies like ExxonMobil for, you know, or for drillers, you know, the Schlumbergers, the Halliburtons of the world? Is the shift away from traditional oil wells and offshore drilling going to be more focused towards natural gas and fracking?
I think it will, and you've already sort of seen that shift. Shell has made a definite commitment to natural gas. You know, they bought BG instead of BP, you know, which was rumored back at the time, and so I think that was a sign, right? They believe gas is the future. You've seen Exxon shift more of its reserves towards gas. You know, and I think that's going to continue. That's really where a lot of the growth is. That's where a lot of the export market appears to be developing. So you're going to see more and more of that. Renewables are going to continue to play a bigger role as well, simply because, you know, certainly in a state like Texas, where we've had dramatic population growth, water is going to become a big concern. You use a lot of water in generating power, and wind and solar don't require it. So I think you look 50 years down the road, part of the reason Texas has had this big push in wind power is because, you know, people have recognized we're going to have a water crisis brought on by our energy needs if we don't do something. So, you know, that mix is going to continue to evolve. But right now, natural gas, because of the intermittency of renewables, natural gas plants can ramp up and down very quickly, and they can offset, you know, if the sun isn't shining, if we have a day where it's raining in Houston, I know that's unusual, but you know, you can kind of fill the gap with natural gas very easily and very quickly and efficiently. So. Yeah.
With George P. Mitchell, you know, he was kind of a visionary in his field and really kind of, you know, this innovator and really was. He was the guy that invented fracking and which really changed the face of energy production in the U.S. for the most part. But, you know, his legacy now is, you know, is what it is. But was there any unfulfilled visions that he wanted to do and didn't get done?
I don't know that he really left anything on the table. You know, certainly later in life, after he sold his company and had money for the first time, you know, his son Scott told me, you know, at age 83, he finally had money. You know, everything he'd leveraged his whole life, and so he didn't know what to do with it. He wound up giving it all away. But one of the things that he did with a lot of his charity was he obviously gave money to Texas A&M for their physics department, for the Mitchell Institute for Astronomy. And then got into, from there, funding the Giant Magellan Telescope, which is going to be one of the key things when it fully comes online in a few years. We'll be actually looking for signs of extraterrestrial life with this. So, you know, I think his legacy is ongoing because we might actually find life on other planets because of his contribution to big science, which is another thing that people kind of forget that he was involved in.
Yeah. This is really interesting now because, you know, as we talk about the United States, we're now a net export of oil. We're seeing more demand for liquefied natural gas, propane, other types of alternative, you know, byproducts really of oil and gas drilling. And, you know, this has really become a change. Of course, now we have, you know, the electric vehicles coming in, trying to figure out the batteries that are all going to make this. You know, when we look down the road 20, 30, 40, 50 years and we take a look at the economy, there's, again, there's one side of this argument in Washington that hates oil and gas companies. We should nationalize them, we should get rid of them. There's lots of opinions. But if you take a look at oil and gas companies, they're 1/4 of the capital expenditures in the country. They're a giant producer of jobs. But there is an interesting change in this. We are watching now with a lot of these companies becoming more technology independent, reducing the amount of their labor force as they're able to automate more and more of these services. Is the trend in the industry to be more automated and more technologically efficient? And again, a key player in the economy for employment and capital expenditures. But it seems that we're able to move in a direction where we can have less employees.
I think that's absolutely true. Certainly on the production end of things, you're going to see more and more automation on rigs, on well sites. For one thing, just from a safety standpoint, you're going to have a lot fewer injuries if you have robots doing the work. But you're seeing a much greater push to automation. The oil industry has been a little slow to adopt this kind of technology, AI and the Internet of Things and all of this. They've done a great job of collecting data from well sites, but they haven't really done much with it, and that's starting to change. You're seeing, for example, Anadarko Petroleum actually had a guy from Silicon Valley, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, appointed to their board specifically to help them with this issue of how to integrate more technology. And I think that the belief is that in another 10 years or so, we're going to see much more automation in terms of the drilling process. And that does raise a significant question about what's going to happen to all those jobs, because one of the things that's important to remember about the oil industry, it's one of the few areas where you can earn a six-figure income without having a college degree. That's right. Still possible to do that. And so if those jobs go away, there's going to be some serious economic ripple effects. And of course, other jobs in other industries could be following the same trend. And so, that's going to be a bigger problem down the road.
I think that's a key point because, if you think about, the impact of drilling a well. So, this is one thing we talk a lot about, at realinvestmentadvice.com as well as the Real Investment Show podcast, is the effects of changes within the economy. Because, for instance, if I go to drill a well, right, I've got to hire a bunch of guys to go out there, be on this well out in the middle of, Midland, Texas, right, just out in the middle of nowhere. Well, they've got to eat, they got to have a place to sleep, they have transportation to get there. So, you've got hotels that come up, you've got restaurants that come up. When North Dakota was booming with the shell industry, all of a sudden, there were strippers going from all across the country to North Dakota because there was such a demand there of all these these roughnecks that were drilling these rigs. There was a lot of money to be made. And so we forget about that when we begin to automate and reduce the workforce on these rigs. There's also all the ancillary effects, particularly having to fly people out to rigs and other stuff.
It's going to be bad for strippers.
And it's going to be bad for strippers. This whole industry is going to hell in a handbasket, including the podcast. So, but this is what we see, these knockoff effects.
No, absolutely, and I think, and like I say, it's not just the oil and gas industry. You're going to see. We're talking about trucking. We're talking about other industries, and this is one of the things that Andrew Yang keeps talking about in his run for the presidency. It's not getting a lot of traction, but I think it's an important issue. I'm not sure it's one that makes you worthy of being president, but that's beside the point. The point is that he's talking about the effect that automation is going to have. We're going to have so many people that are finding that their jobs are being replaced by automation. We're not going to have the ability to retrain all of them, so what are we going to do? We're going to have to start thinking about work in a different way, I suppose. But that would be the kind of issue that George Mitchell would have found really fascinating. And it's just, if he could have hung on a few more years, who knows what sort of insight, he might have had on something like that.
I think that's true. IBM just came out with a study that says in the next, decade to 2 decades, we'll have to retrain 120 million Americans for new jobs. Think about that. That's a tremendous amount of turnover, and retraining is have to be done for some type of work. But this is because the economy is. Our economy is changing. We're developing new technologies. It's amazing the things that have been done, particularly in the oil and gas field, and it goes, again with George Mitchell kind of leading that charge in that way. Your book is out October the 11th. George P. Mitchell has a really long subtitle.
And it's available for pre-order right now on all your favorite online.
There you go.
books.
Go to Amazon.com, etc. Books A Million. You can get your book, and of course, Texas A&M.
Yes.
Was the proud publisher of the book for you.
It was such a natural home for the book. I was really excited that worked out.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it makes all you Aggie fans happy. So, so anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to say?
I think the other thing that I really enjoyed about the book was really Mitchell's early years. I didn't know a lot about his childhood, and it's such a great entrepreneurial story because he came from, humble beginnings is putting it mildly. His mother died when he was 12 years old. His father was an immigrant from Greece who barely spoke English, and kind of just scratched his way around, working different jobs, playing cards on the side, and yet he managed to put 4 kids through college, and there was just kind of this wonderful. The thing that really jumps out as you start tracing the story is that George Mitchell just had this innate ability to find oil and gas that was almost intuitive. And so a lot of people, including guys like Glenn McCarthy and big names in the oil business, turned to him. Red Smith, who had already made a fortune, but he made a second fortune because George Mitchell helped him find an oil field that nobody thought was there. And then in turn, everything that happened in Fort Worth that laid the foundation for fracking, everything that happened in Wise County, was because George Mitchell looked at a field where there had been 13 dry holes drilled and a whole bunch of people had passed on the deal, and he said, I think I see something there. And they re-drilled those 13 wells, and to this day, all but 2 of them, I think, are still producing.
Wow.
So, he just had this incredible ability to understand the geology and kind of think in a broader way. And whether it was, those early days and, sort of the traditional oil and gas business, or later on when he started thinking about big ways to save the planet. It was just a fascinating study in one man's unlimited intellectual curiosity.
Yeah, that's awesome. The name of the book is George P. Mitchell. It's called Fracking, Sustainability, and an Unorthodox Approach to Saving the Planet. Out October the 11th. You can pre-order now at all of your favorite, book resellers, booksellers, Amazons, etc. But make sure you read the book. It's going to be truly fascinating. It's a great story. And Loren, I really appreciate your time today to hang out with us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Loren Steffy, he's the author. And thanks for joining us today on the Real Investment Show podcast. I'm your host, Lance Roberts, and we'll see you next time.